Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, friends, wherever you are joining from. I am Murali Tumarukudi. I'm the director for the G20 Global Initiative on Land Restoration. I'm excited to invite you all to the first global webinar, which we have titled Let's Talk Land, on the new EU restoration law which has been proposed. Before I go to the topic, I will introduce the G20 Global Initiative for a minute. This G20 initiative was started by the heads of state of the G20 countries, which met in Riyadh in November 2020. The global initiative aims to reduce land degradation and restore 50% of global degraded land by 2040. We are working closely with the Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is mandated by the General Assembly in 2020 and is running from 2021 to 2031, and I'm very delighted to have Mary Atella, who oversee that project as well. The proposed EU law on restoration was published in June 2022. And reading through that, I was actually both delighted and almost astonished to see the breadth and length of that vision. So I thought it will be of interest because I'm sure it's going to be a global model in years to come. So we thought we'll start our first webinar on that. And I have a very distinguished panel of experts, including from the European Union, available with us. I will introduce each of the panel members as they come to speak, but I now have the pleasure of introducing Bettina Doser, who is the head of unit of Nature Capital and Ecosystem Health at the European Commission. Before her previous positions in the Directorate General of Environment were head of unit for sustainable freshwater management, as well as head of unit for policy coordination and communication, and assistant to the Director General. Before joining the Directorate General of Environment, she worked in the areas of foreign policy, European Union enlargement, and EU trade policy. Her work experience prior to the European Commission includes positions as the research associate in a policy institute in Germany and as the desk officer in the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She holds master's degree from University of Chicago and the College of Europe. Bettina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Murali. Thank you for these kind introductory words. I am indeed from the European Commission and very happy to be with you today. Extremely grateful for the opportunity to present to you our nature restoration law and to share a discussion with you about it. I am also, I have to say, quite pleased with the title of our seminar today, because you call the law a game changer. And while we are, of course, competing in time and attention with the World Soccer Championship that is currently going on, I think the game that we will be discussing here today is a very different one, because while in soccer there's always one who wins and one who loses, in this game here today, there are only winners. So on this note, let's move to the first slide, please. And I would actually like to start just very briefly with the general context that we're looking at, and to ask the question, what problem are we actually addressing with this initiative? And it is, I think, very clear to everybody here today that what we're trying to address is the global biodiversity crisis that we are all witnessing and living. And of course, this crisis is also very much visible and felt in the European Union. Next slide, please. We have a lot of evidence coming from different sources, and in the European Union, we have the evidence also based on the legislation that we already have. So we've just collected for you here a few areas where we collect evidence, and basically the overall message is that the indicators are alarming. Next slide, please. In parallel to the scientific work that's already been going on and has to continue going on, there's also the political dimension, and the biodiversity crisis has been acknowledged at the highest level and from different calls and fora, and it is very clear the situation is extremely urgent and we must act. Next slide, please. So the European Green Deal, as you may know, is Europe's growth strategy. It's the way that Europe will be taking to convert the continent into a carbon neutral, zero pollution and resource efficient continent by 2050. And restoring and protecting nature is a very integral part of the European Green Deal. Next slide, please. So in particular, this call for nature restoration and protection has been articulated in a high-level political document called the EU Biodiversity Strategy. This dates back a few years now to 2020. It was one of the first actions that came out of the European Green Deal. And the biodiversity agenda is very large. Today, we will be looking in particular at the restoration angle. Next slide, please. So the biodiversity strategy finds actually that while a lot has already been done on nature protection, it is not enough, and we must move from protection to a very large-scale effort of actually restoration. And after much evaluating and testing in Europe and at the Commission, we've come to the conclusion that the best way forward is for us to come forward with actually a legal instrument that sets into legal tools what we are trying to achieve overall in terms of ambition. Next slide, please. So the international context is, of course, also very apparent, and this proposal is well timed. It is really the right political momentum in the global context also, especially as we are going towards COP15 next week. And for us, we will be able to show that the EU actually takes the global objectives of halting and reversing biodiversity loss extremely seriously. We, of course, also support the climate targets that have just been discussed in the most recent climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. Next slide, please. So maybe just very briefly, what were the elements considered when the new nature restoration law was designed? And here the key is to consider that we are not starting entirely from new. Rather, we are trying to use and build upon what we already have in terms of actually quite developed legislation at the European level. And we're trying to exploit the synergies, so not to create too much extra layers and burdens, but to make the existing legislation work together better in this new framework that clearly helps us to set the ambition with the help of the existing legislation, but towards these new goals of the biodiversity strategy. And this meant, of course, also a clever design of these targets so that they don't repeat what we already have, but complement and make it work better. Next slide, please. Maybe it's good also, before we dive into the substance, to have just a joint understanding of what we mean by restoration. So in terms of a definition, restoration of nature can be both an active and a passive process to assist the recovery of our ecosystems. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Also, just to illustrate in practice what we're trying to achieve, we now have a few slides that are just a sort of before and after picture of what nature restoration can achieve. So here we see, for example, alpine meadows. Next slide, please. Here we see a transformation of agricultural land. Next slide, please. And here we have more particularly agricultural land that has been drained and that is reconverted into its original status. And a final slide with before and after. Next slide, please. Yeah, here you see on the left-hand side a forest that has only single species of tree next to a landscape that is composed by a more natural way with different types of tree species also. Next slide, please. Maybe also to stress once again, because this point is really important, that restoration is already happening across the EU. So we're also not starting from zero on the practical side, but it is very clear that the scale has to become much larger in terms of achieving what we have set ourselves as objectives. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the nature restoration law itself in a bit more detail. Here you see the individual pictures that actually make up the proposal, and the building blocks are, on the one hand, the overall objective. Then we have the targets that help us reach the objectives, and then we have an implementation framework that sets out how we can get where we're trying to go. Next slide, please. The overarching objective, as we know, is by 2030 to have restoration measures in place on 20% of the EU's land and seas, and by 2050 then measures in place for all ecosystems in need of restoration. So here we see the clear difference to the approach that had been taken so far, which was about protection of habitats and of designing certain areas as nature protection zones and so on. Clearly now we're looking at the whole territory of Europe. And the overarching EU level objective is coupled with a set of binding targets that the member states will have to reach in a range of specific ecosystems. We have put them here side by side. So the proposal includes targets on habitats and on species that are already covered by our legislation, the so-called Birds and Habitats directives. And we also have targets on forest, wetlands, rivers and lakes, grasslands and marine habitats and wild birds. And in addition to those, we have targets that go beyond because they're more horizontal and not necessarily area-based. So we're talking about greening our cities, improving connectivity of rivers, and also reversing the decline of pollinators. Next slide, please. How are we going to do this? So the main feature of the law are the so-called national restoration plans that our member states will be devising. And in these plans, they have a lot of flexibility in terms of defining the areas where the measures will start, in terms of defining what measures will be taken. And what is also extremely important to know is that this is not a process that happens in isolation in the public authorities. By contrast, it is a process that involves to a large degree the stakeholders, the public, the interest, the industry, because everybody will need to participate in the implementation. Thereafter, again, here we also benefit from the fact that the pieces of environmental law that this law builds upon already include quite comprehensive provisions for involving public consultations, exchanges with stakeholders, and so on. So all this brought together will mean that these national restoration plans are really a transparent and inclusive process. Next slide, please. In addition to drawing up these plans, member states will also monitor and thereafter report on the progress that they achieve. And they will have regular exchanges on this. They will report to us in the European Commission together with the European Environment Agency, which helps and supports the collection of this data. And together with the agency, will then also periodically assess the progress made and inform via our own reporting requirements that we have put into the law, so that everybody, and especially also the European citizens, are made aware of the progress, hopefully, that we will be making. Next slide, please. Finally, on the substance of the law, there are, of course, also the usual horizontal parts like access to justice, the delegation of powers to groups and to the European Commission, and a review process. So the whole law will actually be looked at after some years' time to see whether it has worked the way it was intended. Next slide, please. The law is based on an impact assessment, like all legislation that comes out of the European Commission. That was a very thorough process of assessing what is needed and what the costs and benefits of these calculations arrive at. And we have actually been able to make an overall aggregation that is very simple and that you can see here on the slide. It means in monetary terms, for every euro that we spend on restoration with the help of this law, we will have a delivered return of 8 euros, because in as far as it is possible to quantify and measure the benefits that will come out of restored and healthy ecosystems, as we have seen, it is really worth it. Next slide, please. A very important question that always comes up in this context is who will actually pay for all this, and how can we make sure that the restoration measures that we want to take to implement the law can take place, because financing is of course critical. So under the current multi-annual financial framework, which is the structure under which the European Union manages its budget, there's around 100 billion euros that can be used for biodiversity spending. And this comes from different funds. We have listed them here on the slide for you. I know there's a lot of abbreviations, but basically these are a range of European funds that serve agriculture purposes, regional and cohesion funds. There's also instruments for fisheries, and there is the LIFE program, which finances environmental investments. There's research funding. So overall, there is really a large possibility to invest in biodiversity under the EU budget. According to the EU biodiversity strategy, at least 20 billion euros a year should be unlocked for spending on nature. And we actually have agreed to dedicate to the biodiversity objectives 7.5% of the annual spending already as soon as 2024, and then 10% in the years thereafter. Now, having said this, it is of course crucial that the member states make the best possible use of these funds, and they opt for biodiversity in their spending of the EU funding. And it is necessary that the strategic plans are in place as soon as possible to better match the needs also. What is not on the slide, but what is obvious, is that the public funding part, be it from EU funds or from national or regional funding in the member states, will not be enough. So we also have to go towards a process whereby private funding is increasingly included in the overall considerations and bill, and private investments start coming about on a much larger scale for restoration purposes. Next slide, please. So in order to conclude, I've kept it brief because this will give us more time for introducing and thinking about the different aspects of the law. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are experiencing a biodiversity and climate crisis in parallel, and urgent action is needed. And we hope that with this law, which enables us in Europe to really work towards our targets, we will be able to make progress very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina, for this laying the ground for the discussions. When I first read the biodiversity law, I was most stunned by two things. One was the water connectivity, that it had proposed that 25,000 kilometers of river or water bodies will be allowed to flow freely, and also the target on the pollinators. And this is why why we mentioned it's a game changer, because I think this is where the world is going to go in years to come. I now have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Nick Brown, who is the principal of Linacre College, Oxford University. Nick and I have been working together for last close to 30 years. Our work started in Brunei, where Nick was involved in restoration of a highly damaged and degraded ecosystem in the Borneo. And that has been the focus of his work. And Nick has worked in a number of UN projects in post-conflict and post-disaster situations in Rwanda, in Iraq, Iran, Gaza, and the regions affected by the 2004 tsunami. He is also the science advisor to the European Union Outdoor Conservation Association. He holds a master's degree from Cambridge University and a master's degree from University of Aberdeen and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. Nick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Murali, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. It's a great pleasure to take part in this really fascinating discussion. And Bettina, thank you so much for that really lucid description of this new legislation. I think there is a very succinct answer to the question posed by our chair in the title. Is this a game changer? My answer is yes, it is. But let me go into that a little bit more deeply. First of all, I think a really important question is more legislation the most appropriate way of achieving our policy objectives, our objectives of trying to reverse the fact that nature is unquestionably in crisis and we need to do something about it urgently. I regret to say that the UK has withdrawn from the EU, and one of the reasons that our politicians put forward that was the bureaucracy and overburden of legislation that was a consequence of our membership. It's clear that there is a lot of legislation surrounding nature conservation, and I think it's a good principle of public policy that unnecessary legislation should be avoided because it always involves significant cost. And making good legislation requires a great deal of expertise and a great deal of time and effort. Bad legislation often undermines the legitimacy of your policy objectives. So do we need more legislation in a European context? Because Europe has a reputation globally of being one of those areas of the world with very effective nature conservation legislation. What has gone wrong that we need new legislation? Well, the cornerstone of current legislation, of course, is the Habitats Directive. The Habitats Directive now reaching its 30th anniversary. On paper, very, very strong duty, legal duty for conservation. Conservation, of course, being the maintenance of the status quo. And I think perhaps where the Habitats Directive is now beginning to show its age is that it has relatively weak provision for restoration. Restoration, of course, doesn't seek to maintain the status quo, but seeks to re-establish, or in some cases, establish for the first time, important ecosystem functions that have been lost. Now, in my opinion, the Habitat Directive lacks robust, specific and measurable restoration norms. It has a relatively weak baseline for measuring change, and it has no deadlines in place for the achievement of what it describes as progressive realization of favorable conservation status. So I think probably what I would flag up as one of the first reasons we need new legislation is to introduce some of those robust, measurable and specific restoration norms. I think a second area, which quite understandably the Habitats Directive lacks provision for, is adaptation to climate change. Climate change 30 years ago, although we were aware of it as scientists, hadn't become a major policy issue. But these days, of course, climate change is the most significant threat, not only to European biodiversity and habitats, but to those globally. 35% of 300 species which Voss et al. Looked at amongst European bird species had a very high or an extremely high vulnerability to climate change. So we really need a new legislative tool that will promote resilience to climate change and mitigation of that change. And I'm thinking here perhaps of measures such as the promotion of healthy soils, something that's of particular interest to the G20 Global Land Initiative, but might also include things, as Murali has already mentioned, improving connectivity and the reintroduction of important ecosystem engineers. The third area where I think we need new legislation is because of the limits of the Habitats Directive to a number of species and habitats of community interest. We need a much more holistic approach to restoration than the Habitats Directive gives provision for. The focus of the Habitats Directive on a limited number of species and habitats of community interest greatly reduces its capacity to address more widespread conservation and restoration issues. So let me turn as a critical friend to what I think of the new regulation. First of all, great to see that it's a regulation, which will mean it has real legal teeth. So I think that was a very sensible decision. There were, Bettina outlined, there are the two overarching objectives. First of all, 2030, the restoration of 20% of EU land and sea area. I wish there had been the political will to keep that at the 30 by 30 that was originally proposed in the EU biodiversity proposals. I think 20% is a rather slim proportion of our land to tackle. And 2050, I wish we had the capacity to implement this more quickly, because this is really urgent legislation. I admire the ecosystem-specific regimes. Those are really important. They have very clear quantifiable restoration measures, which I think is a major improvement. And I also applaud the national restoration plans, which provide transparency and are science informed and will monitor data to document losses, and that's losses going back over at least 70 years. I also like the fact that it has a dedicated section on climate change mitigation and adaptation, which is a major step forward. And as with all good plans, there is a very clear implementation plan and details of financing. That's absolutely essential for making it work. So generally, this gets a big thumbs up from me as a critical friend of nature conservation in Europe. I think this is a significant step forward, and I hope that this provides a model that other regions across the globe can follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick, for your remarks. Indeed, this is our hope that the legislation becomes a model for other countries and region. And legislating it in with some teeth certainly would move the needle a lot more better and faster than other voluntary approaches. I would now invite Mire Atalla from UN Environment Program. She is the head of Nature for Climate branch. Mire has been working in UN system for over 15 years and joins us from UNEP in Nairobi. And she oversees the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. A land use planner and an agronomist by training, Mire is a bird enthusiast, a legacy of her work with BirdLife International, the Ministry of Environment, and the various NGOs she supported prior to joining the UN. Mire is a national of Lebanon and holds a master's degree in environmental policy from Agro-Paris Tech University in Paris and a Bachelor of Science degree in agriculture from the American University of Beirut. She is fluent in English, French, Arabic, and confident in Spanish. She expresses that her main goal in life is to bridge the divide between well-being of humans and that of the planet that hosts us. Mire may have a connectivity problem, so she may or may not open her camera, but Mire, you have the floor.
Hi, Murali, thank you very, very much. I have actually opened my camera, so I do hope that you can that you can see me.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I think that for those of you who don't know the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, it was a decision taken by the General Assembly of the UN back in 2019, and had received a lot of support from member states. Because of exactly some of the things that were mentioned in the presentation today, that have led to the EU taking on passing this or considering this law. First and foremost is the fact that despite a lot of conservation efforts, we are still losing nature. Second is that despite many efforts to mainstream nature into different economic sectors, into land use planning, into land tenure processes, pressure on natural habitats and natural ecosystems continues to increase. And in the UNEP perspective, it's also a matter of the compounded effect of climate change together with nature and biodiversity loss, together with pollution and pollution loads in natural habitats. So the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is not only about trying to recover ecosystems as they were, but also in order to prevent the perception that ecosystems lost can be restored as they were, the UN Decade aims actually at preserving, sustainably using, and restoring ecosystems. So just wanted to give that general background about this. I think that some of the common issues that we see as well is that the idea behind the UN Decade is really to apply what we call the new power approach, and to make sure that we have all walks of life, people from all walks of life essentially involved in this movement, and really creating a critical mass of supporters and of people who will and of stakeholders across the board who will do that. So far, the UN Decade has around 150 partner organizations around the world, some of which are directly involved in the implementation of restoration initiatives. Others are more involved in the communication and the advocacy for that. And others are involved in ensuring that communities, whether it's indigenous peoples, whether it's women, whether it's other stakeholders are part of that movement, and that their rights are adequately represented. One of the opportunities that we see with this EU law is a potential spillover effect in terms of replication in other countries. We see that there's already a number of countries that are that have made commitments, but in terms of restoration. However, what we also see is that unless commitments are followed by allocation of budgets, by enforcement, by implementation, they remain that. They remain a wishful commitment. And so one of the things that we see is that what it takes to trigger behavior change and to trigger impact is a combination of being able to provide the technical solutions and the practices actually that that represent robust ecosystem restoration. For that, the UN Decade has put in place the 10 principles of ecosystem restoration. Second aspect that is absolutely critical is the regulatory framework, whether it's for enforcement or encouragement, and having incitative measures. And third is really putting in place the fiscal and financial kind of policies that will support both the implementation of the technical solutions and the enforcement of the regulatory framework. Yesterday, UNEP launched the State of Finance for Nature report, or actually it was today, launched the State of Finance for Nature report. What is clear is that we are far below what is needed in terms of funding for ensuring that the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the land degradation crises are addressed. Currently, according to the quantification, we stand at roughly $154 billion for nature. What would be needed by 2025 is in the order of 384. And what we see is that the level of funding that is actually going, that is nature negative, let's say, or that is going to the destruction of nature is much more important than the amount of financing that is going for nature restoration and in its broad sense. So where we see the critical importance of this law again is that it might provide the incentive measures and mechanisms for the private sector. It can help change the perspective about nature as a public good having to be subsidized by the public sector versus nature as a critical asset for businesses, societies, and economies that has to be supported and internalized into the private sector as well. So with this, I mean, I have to say that we are extremely excited about this law. We do hope that it will be a beam of hope and and you know that it will be taken up and replicated elsewhere. And within the UN Decade, we would be, first of all, we very much welcome this webinar. Murali, thank you so much for organizing this, but we would also like to use the UN Decade to amplify the message, to share information around the law, and to possibly support other countries in not necessarily copying it, but devising laws that would be of a similar reach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, for your intervention. Indeed, it is also our hope that there will be a massive spillover effect from this law, both in terms of legislation, but also technology and financing means for achieving restoration. We now have the final presenter for the day, Dr. Karen Sedmeyer-Ryu. She's a senior expert ecology, disaster risk reduction. Dr. Karen is an environmental education and outreach specialist with 2 decades of experience in researching, teaching, and publishing on ecosystem restoration for reducing climate risk. Karen was the lead developer of 2 massive open online courses, most notably the nature-based solution for disaster and climate resilience, which now have 70,000 registered participants. She is an affiliated senior scientist at the Cologne University, the Technical University of Cologne, the Cologne University of Applied Sciences. Prior to joining this, Karen was senior advisor disaster risk reduction with the United Nations Environment Program's Disasters and Conflict Program in Geneva, Switzerland, where she managed several large projects related to ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. Karen is also a scholar of ecosystem management for landslide management and developed the concept of eco-safe roads with expertise from the Himalayas. She holds a PhD in environmental science from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and master's degree in international development and forest ecology from Switzerland and the United States. She continues to give university lectures and mentors students worldwide. Karen, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Murali. Thank you, colleagues, for the invitation to share a few thoughts on how the EU restoration law, the proposed EU restoration law is related to disaster and climate risk reduction. If you could start the first slide, please, we can get started. Great. We can go to the next slide. So the new binding targets suggested by the law include several points which were covered by Bettina. And I'd like to concentrate on those related to something extremely important, which is reducing climate and disaster risks. So I'd like to focus on 5 of the main new binding targets suggested by the law related to green urban spaces, related to restoring drained peatlands, healthier forests with improved biodiversity, free-flowing rivers, which was mentioned before, and restoring seagrasses and sea bottoms. And how are all of these related to disaster and climate risk reduction? Next slide, please. Now, what's important is that all of these different ecosystems do not exist in silos. They are all interconnected across our landscapes. So it's important to keep that in mind that while undertaking ecosystem restoration, one of the objectives being reducing disaster risks, that we take a landscape approach. So my brief presentation will cover all of those ecosystems along this landscape continuum. Next slide, please. Let's start in our mountain areas. Now, deforestation in mountains throughout Europe in the 1800s led to huge flooding in the valleys, depicted here from Switzerland and from Netherlands. And it's important to learn from history to understand the importance of restoration. These large disaster events did lead to very early restoration efforts in the Alps in the 1800s, especially in France where I live, but also in Switzerland and other countries. Please go to the next slide. So let's continue on the theme of forests and protection forests, which have been instituted in Switzerland, France, Austria, and other alpine countries, where protection forests add extreme value to reducing mountain hazards throughout the Alps, which means reducing the impact from avalanches, rockfall, and landslides. And these this village would not exist, this is from Davos, Switzerland, without protection forests. And the cost would be so much higher if we had to replace these forests with concrete or steel barriers. Now, in some cases, there are some concrete or steel barriers in addition to the protection forests. But the protection forests are highly valued by the population, and they're managed for their biodiversity, because these forests are stronger and more robust the more diverse they are, with different ages of tree stands. Next slide, please. So moving down our landscape continuum, what we find is nature-based solutions, various types of solutions for urban environments, especially for reducing heat waves and flooding. Now, we will be, of course, unfortunately, be experiencing more heat waves. We saw already a very high impact from the heat waves this summer throughout Europe, and flooding being the hazard which European countries are most prone to. So we have nature-based solutions at various scales, and these are important, both at small scale restoration, such as urban gardens, rooftops, and pervious parking lots, which means that parking lots also have grasses where water can be infiltrated in the soil. Bioswales means these types of sidewalks with grasses for water infiltration, water retention basins, which most parking lots or shopping malls now must have, but also large-scale restoration, looking at restoring our wetlands, forests, riverbanks for increasing water filtration in upper watersheds. And again, keeping in mind the importance of holistic watershed approaches, because stopping water will not happen just at the city limits. It also is needed in upper watersheds to reduce urban flooding. Next slide, please. Now, river renaturation projects are happening all throughout Europe already. And I could see how the EU restoration law would enhance this trend. So this is an image from the Netherlands, where making space for water was a huge project that involved a very frank and serious look at the river dikes, for which Netherlands is famous, and the fact that these river dikes no longer protect populations living alongside these rivers from extreme weather events. So what happened was, over the course of 10 years, there were over 2,000 public consultations with Dutch communities, looking at how to reduce the risk from flooding. And in many cases, most cases, the Dutch communities decided to remove the river dikes and allow the rivers to go their natural state, which is meandering. This involved, in some cases, removing villages, buildings from being right next to rivers, and creating other spaces, such as recreational spaces, which could be flooded, and also compensating farmers for periodic flooding as well. Next slide. So why is it so important with meandering rivers? Well, they reduce water velocity. When we have channelized rivers with river dikes next to them, this may protect habitants or cities from immediate flooding, may or may not, but especially it creates for higher water velocity, which creates more risk downstream. So this is why we're seeing this increase in renaturing rivers across Europe and other places of the world as well, by the way. Next slide, please. Now, peatlands can exist in the upper watersheds and also downstream. Now, they are extremely important. Worldwide, they only cover 3% of the global land, but they absorb twice as much carbon as forests. Peatlands are also important for providing clean water, and 43% of the UK population have their drinking water coming from peatlands. Okay, next slide, please. We're getting down to the coastline. Seagrasses are an amazing ecosystem, often overlooked, because not only do they absorb energy from waves, but they're also fantastic for reducing, for particle trapping, for CO2 uptake, and also for protecting reefs. Next slide. By order of things, I probably should put sand dunes before the seagrasses, but never mind. Finally, sand dunes for coastal wave attenuation are very, they're fantastic natural barriers, as well as harboring habitats for various wildlife. and these are disappearing very quickly. So let's finalize with the last slide. So my main point is that restoration, yes, for biodiversity, obviously, but let's not forget that these are also very important physical and natural buffers and protective barriers for human security, livelihoods, and well-being. So with that, I'd like to thank you for that quick presentation, and back over to you, Murali. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I want to thank all the speakers for their excellent presentation, as well as sticking to the time, so that we have plenty of time for discussions. We have over 200 audience live at all times since we started, which is exceptional. We also have audience on the social media, and we have been receiving questions. So audience, please continue to post your questions as Q&A on the Zoom link, as well as comments on the social media channels. Our team is watching this and they are picking those up, and I will answer those questions. I will ask those questions to the panelists. If you want to direct a question to a specific panelist, also feel free to write those. So I'll start with a question to Bettina. Bettina, the EU regulations have in the past stimulated growth of private sector, for example, the landfill directive or contaminated land directive, etc. Do you expect a similar, almost a restoration industry to evolve in Europe out of the new law? And what other role do you anticipate private sector to play in implementation of this restoration law? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important question. So as Nick has mentioned, actually the legal form of our law is a so-called regulation, which means it is addressed directly to the member states. They have to act. So formally, there's no direct obligations on the private sector. But this, of course, doesn't mean that the private sector is not concerned. On the contrary, it's clear that there are implications for the private sector. The private sector must be an active part of this transition that we're trying to undertake. And there are also many opportunities in there. So what are these? First of all, the law foresees, and this I've mentioned in my presentation, that the process of developing these plans and measures is a transparent and inclusive one. So the private sector should make themselves available for this and participate in that. Second, different parts of the private sector are more concerned. So for example, the farming sector is very much concerned because they really need to proactively embrace this transformation, change the way that they produce and the landscape in which they produce. We've seen the before, after pictures, and change maybe the crops that they plant and the way they use the land. And this also has huge opportunities. I think there was also a question about pesticides and what Europe does for or against pesticides and how this links. Just like to answer that in this context, because this is also an integral part of the whole idea of this law. If we get nature back to work on its own in a healthy ecosystem, we don't need these artificial pesticides. And there are already many good examples from across Europe that show that it is very much possible to have agriculture at very high yield levels without these artificial pesticides. Other private sector that is very much concerned by this law is forests. And I've also shown a picture of a before and after forest landscape. So in the same vein, we need to move our forests to become productive again, and also to be more resilient, because single tree species forests are very much at risk of complete destruction if there's a pest or a climate change impact, whereas a more diverse forest is definitely more robust and then can also be used for things that go beyond only wood exploitation, for tourists, for recreation, and so on. But I think the most important message to the private sector would be that the overall opportunity is really to change the mindset and to see the restoration action in itself as an economic opportunity. This can create jobs, and this has a long-term perspective. These investments will have a return, as I've mentioned also before. So it's really a big opportunity for the private sector to get involved.
Thank you, Bettina, for the comprehensive answer, and as well picking up on the question of the pesticides. So I will now come to Mire. Mire, within the context of the decade for ecosystem restoration, what are the opportunities for us to promote the EU restoration law or the principles of the EU restoration law across other parts of the world? Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Morali. I think the UN decade is composed of or comprises a number of task forces, a very large advisory group that is made of very many stakeholders and is very much looking at flagships. Soon on the 13th of December at the CBD COP, we will be announcing the first batch of 10 world flagships on ecosystem restoration. And flagships don't necessarily need to be direct projects implemented on the ground. Flagships can also be good practices in terms of either legislative or financial and fiscal mechanisms, or entrepreneurs that are encouraging more and more the restoration movement. And so in that sense, through our best practices initiative or task force, this can definitely be communicated with the very many. We have at least 78 countries that have signed up for flagships. So through that, it can also be some of our partners in the UN decade are actually, for example, we are working with ILC on land governance, on rights and tenure. One of our partners is Wetlands International. I think it was Karen who mentioned peatlands and wetland re-wetting. So these are some of the partners through which the EU restoration law can be communicated and can be amplified. Now, what will be interesting as well, and this is why I find that the concept of the decades is very interesting, is that putting in place a law is one thing, implementing it and tracking its impacts is another. And because the UN decade extends until 2030, this is definitely something that we can do so that we go a step further beyond the robustness, the legal robustness of the law, towards the implementation impact of that law. And this we can do through our task force on monitoring that is putting in place a global framework for monitoring ecosystem restoration across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mire. Karen, if I come back to you on your chosen domain of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, in what way the EU restoration law contribute to meeting the international commitments on climate change and disaster risk reduction?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Murali. I believe that Bettina alluded to this already in her presentation, where she mentioned the Paris Agreement. Obviously, restored ecosystems will be much better at absorbing CO2, as well as meeting several goals of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Convention of Biological Diversity was also mentioned starting next week, where we hope that language on disaster risk reduction will also be included in the new biodiversity agreement. there and targets. But also very importantly, which was not mentioned yet, is the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a non-binding but very important international agreement, which encourages countries around the world to invest more in various mechanisms for reducing disaster risk. We know that disasters are causing a huge amount of economic and human suffering. And so also by investing in ecosystems, EU countries will also be able to meet that international commitment. By the way, we can also refer to ecosystems as green infrastructure, which is mentioned by the Sendai framework, but no countries have yet to report on progress on this target. So we're looking to EU leadership to be amongst the first in doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. So, Nick, one of the objectives, as I mentioned, is to see how the EU legislation can be spilled over to other parts of the world. And coming from Oxford University, how do you think we can use research as a tool to use to get other parts of the world to look at legislation as a way of achieving some of the restoration objectives?
That's a very good question, Murali, and I think we can. I think the academic field of the analysis of public policy is not only a growing but a flourishing one. And we have seen during the COVID pandemic some very insightful analyses of the strategies used by global governments for controlling and mitigating the COVID pandemic within their countries, and some very clear conclusions coming from that about successful strategies versus those that work less well. So one of the things I think it will be very interesting to see as this legislation is rolled out is that type of analysis of the effectiveness of legislation versus other policy tools, such as, for instance, engaging with the private sector and NGOs. I think the other sort of contribution that an institution like mine can make is surrounding the sorts of data that we need in order to make this legislation effective. Because I think having good data and a good understanding of effective restoration strategies is fundamental to making sure that legislation is the right tool for the job. I'm really pleased to see that there's actually plenty of provision in this new legislation proposal for research. And I hope that that research not only includes biology, but also includes sociology and politics. But even here in Europe, we still have a lot to learn yet about restoration strategies. There's still a tremendous amount of research to be done. I give it as an example, one area that I'm particularly interested in, which is the role of fungi as ecosystem engineers. And we know already that they play a fundamental role in helping ecosystems recover swiftly and to develop resilience. But we know very little about their taxonomy or their ecology. I'd also put in a word here for the importance of consulting with indigenous peoples groups and local communities, who very often, although they don't have a long research tradition like this university does, very often have a profound understanding of the way that the ecosystems in which they operate work. And I think there's a great deal that we can learn from them about successful restoration strategies.
Thank you, Nick, for that answer. And starting off on the question of the indigenous communities, there is indeed a question on that from the floor, and this about how is the voice of the indigenous community is picked up. So, Mire, do you have any further information on whether the Decade for Ecosystem Restoration has a specific engagement strategy for the indigenous community? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Murali. So in that sense, I think there is a very clear recognition in the General Assembly resolution itself about indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, I think I saw in the chat someone put in that nearly 80% of biodiversity is actually protected by indigenous peoples and occurs in indigenous peoples' lands. So already in the resolution itself, there is a very clear acknowledgement and recognition of the role of indigenous peoples. At the second level, within the governance framework of the UN decade, indigenous peoples are represented in all of our task forces, as well as have a seat in our the advisory board of the UN decade. So therefore, giving a specific voice, equal voice to indigenous peoples, together with representatives of other stakeholder groups. And lastly, indigenous peoples are also represented in all our task forces. And I would really like to echo what Nick has just mentioned, including, for instance, in the best practices, including in the monitoring, which typically are approaches that usually are delegated to technicians or scientists, where we see, for example, in the best practices, we see that there's a huge opportunity for biomimicry in terms of ecosystem restoration as a technology. What we also see, for instance, in terms of monitoring, is that actually indigenous communities are very inclined towards technology leapfrogging. And we have seen communities that, went straight to the utilization of drones or of other modern tools for monitoring, without having to do the progression through the GIS and the satellite imagery and so on and so forth. And so we see that there is a huge opportunity for the involvement of indigenous communities, not only in terms of, if I can put it this way, not only in terms of extracting their knowledge and amplifying it, but also in terms of involving them and in that technological advances. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you, Mary. We are very happy to see that there's a specific engagement strategy and involvement of the indigenous community. We in the G20 initiative also plan to work with the indigenous community, and as always, we'll work together. So I want to recognize the presence of Minister Reina Sotilo in the audience, and she has a question to Bettina, which is about the support which the European Union can provide to developing countries, in particular, her area of interest in Latin America and Caribbean, towards matters regarding restoration. Thank you. Bettina.
Thank you very much. Yes, so maybe to start a bit from the bottom end, we are talking about the nature restoration law in Europe and how it can relate to other places of and in the world. And while we have found that in Europe, going the legal way is the way to go and actually a must-have and not a nice to have. Someone has also said that maybe in other parts of the world, the legal approach, or at least not the exact same legal approach, may not be the right one. And I think this is a very important point. We need to see what our overall objectives are and how we can best reach them. And here, of course, the EU is happy to work and is working with all its partners in many different types of cooperation. There is, so of course, the multilateral cooperation, including on desertification, but we also have bilateral agreements, including with Latin America and the Caribbean. We have trade agreements, and all these institutionalized relations have a big scope for sustainability issues as well. But I cannot not say that I think the biggest opportunity for all of us starts right now and next week at COP15, because there we really have the opportunity jointly, Latin America, Caribbean, but also the rest of the world, to agree on really ambitious restoration work and targets. So In this context, the EU is going to Montreal with the strong commitment and hope to achieve their restoration targets that would cover both natural and semi-natural areas, and that will be shared by everybody. We've heard about the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, which is doing extremely useful work, but on its own, it's not enough. We need something in addition to take us forward. And the EU, as we have discussed at length now, is serious about this because we're doing at home even a law. The second point, and this has also already been alluded to, is that the EU wishes to help its partner countries around the world, also with the collection, management, and improvement of knowledge about the biodiversity crisis in the various areas of the world. So we are going to Montreal in support of a global knowledge support service for biodiversity, a center where this knowledge can come together and where we can all work together and help each other in making sure that we interconnect, that we use the technology we already have. Satellite technology was mentioned, for example, and that we also support all ongoing efforts and bring them together in a more efficient way. By the way, let me mention that there will be an event about this on the 7th of December, so right on day one at lunchtime, and our commissioner will be there, and we really hope that as many partner countries as possible will also attend and follow this initiative and join the Global Support Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bettina. It's extremely interesting to hear about this Global Support Center. Indeed, one of the objectives of the global initiative is also to establish a global information hub on best practices. And as Mireille mentioned, they are also looking at the flagship. So there are many ways in which we can collaborate, and I would be there at Montreal, and I will certainly join in for the session, provided I can locate the room where it's happening. It's always a challenge. So there is a specific question to Dr. Karen, which is about, is it possible to use ecosystem-based solution along the coastal zones across the world to protect us from tsunamis and tidal storms? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting and a tricky question at the same time. I should say it depends on the coastal ecosystem. It depends on the type of vegetation that would grow naturally in these areas. There was a lot of talk about mangroves after the Indian Ocean tsunami, as you probably know. Unfortunately, 9 out of 10 restoration projects failed in Sri Lanka after the Indian Ocean tsunami. This is because a lot of the restoration projects didn't take into consideration proper ecological conditions. So, I mean, yes and no. What's important to know there is that we must work with local ecologists. We must understand the coastal ecosystems before starting any restoration projects. And I hope you agree with that point, Nick. If possible, I'd like to make a quick point on already existing practices. For example, there is the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guaranteed Scheme, which is already a huge restoration project in a way. This is a huge government project in India, which exists in all 29 states. The main goal is poverty alleviation. It's a cash for work program, but a lot of the work they do is restoration work. And the EU has already supported UNEP. In my previous role, I was working on an EcoDR project supported by the European International Cooperation Division, which helped to consolidate ecosystem-based disastrous reduction in this large program in India. So best practices are already being promoted by the European Union through this type of international cooperation. And so those practices do exist in many developing countries, although under different names. So take a closer look at what's happening in your country and see how you can support such types of upscaling projects. Thank you. And I see Nick has his hand up and maybe wants to respond to my comment.
Yes, thank you, Karen. It's very interesting that you refer to the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which incidentally, last month, the government announced that these funds can also be used for land restoration, in addition to the eco-DRR, which is excellent. Nick, I see that you have your hands up, but as I give the floor to you, there is a specific question on the question of invasive species, which can also, come in during the restoration process, and what systems one can put in place to ensure that restoration does not lead to further introduction of invasive species. Nick.
Great, thank you, Murali. And really, I was just going to give a big thumbs up to what Karen has already said about the potential for restoration of coastal forests. I think we always tend to think, of technological solutions rather than perhaps nature-based solutions. And I think one of the lessons that we learned from global attempts to try and replant mangroves following the Boxing Day tsunami in the Indian Ocean was that actually very often steaming in there and planting stuff doesn't work very well. I think there's less than 20% of the area of mangrove that was planted as a consequence of the efforts following that tsunami has actually survived and established. And I think what we've learned from that actually is that you need to get the environmental conditions right. I think this was a lesson that you and I learned long ago back out in Brunei, Murali, that actually planting doesn't necessarily recreate an ecosystem, that you need to have all of the right components of the ecosystem, particularly including the environment, right, before you can begin a successful restoration strategy. And this is often actually where indigenous knowledge can be really useful, because many local people have a really intimate knowledge of how the environment needs to be prepared before any interventions can be successful. So turning to the second question on invasive species, this is a really interesting question, because one of the big challenges at the moment in restoration initiatives is not just simply creating viable ecosystems that are self-sustaining, but of also adapting to very rapid climate change. Mm-hmm. What we're finding is that often species which we would perhaps have classified traditionally as being native species belonging to that ecosystem are finding themselves increasingly stressed and poorly ecologically adapted to the environments in which we're trying to restore them, particularly if that environment has become degraded or polluted in some way. And often it will be necessary to introduce novel species in order to overcome many of the environmental limitations that are preventing natural succession from happening. So I think perhaps we need to be a little bit more pragmatic and less purist about our approaches to restoration, and understand that in a globally changing world and a very rapidly changing world, we need to try and assemble ecosystems which provide adequately for ecosystem function, and perhaps be a little bit less purist about restricting ourselves to a very narrow palette of perhaps increasingly less well adapted native species. Now, clearly we need to be cautious about not introducing species which are going to become monodominant. And you and I will remember seeing some of those prosopis forests in the Middle East. Yeah, that clearly isn't a good situation, and it's a situation which it's very difficult to reverse. But I think there is a really important opportunity to explore the potential for ecosystem restoration using non-native species.
Okay, thank you, Nick, for that answer. I still remember the time we spent to work on the prosopis invasion in Oman. Mire, there are a couple of questions about how can we increase the advocacy effort to wider population, and how do we support the restoration effort by individuals at a very local level. So does the decade have any engagement action with the general public as part of your strategy?
Thank you very much, Murali, and thank you very much for this question in particular. If you allow me, Murali, I would just like to bounce back also on introduced species. I think I mentioned the 10 principles of ecosystem restoration. Among others, it's also about making sure that it's healthy soils, healthy pollinators, diverse ecosystems, and that we are essentially, we acknowledge that we cannot recreate nature as it was created, but that we can at least aim to mimic it to the extent possible. And so I would encourage those interested in that question, in that issue, to look up the 10 principles, and I can put in a link as well in the chat. On citizen engagement, this is one of the big aspects of the decade, is that we consider that any small action, any aggregate, like aggregating small actions, citizen actions, doesn't necessarily need to be hundreds or thousands of hectares. It can be in one's backyard. One of the key ecosystems that we are looking at in particular is urban environments and green solutions for urban environments, but also sensitizing urban dwellers, because we do know that by 2050, 80% of the global population is going to be living in an urban environment. We want to make sure that there remains some sort of a connection between urban dwellers and nature, because once that connect is lost, the empathy to nature is also lost. And so there is currently, we are in January 2023, we will be launching a relatively sizable project or initiative to engage mayors, municipalities, citizens, urban dwellers in ecosystem restoration. And we're calling it Restoration in Your Backyard, so that everyone feels that they have something to contribute, rather than, for instance, the global goal of the UN decade is 1 billion hectares of ecosystems restored, which, when you say it this way, can seem very daunting, and individuals can feel that this is not something that they can take up. But it's the power of tiny gains, right? It's one backyard together with another backyard that will bring us to this billion hectares. And we do hope to have, through our partners network, is how we are aiming to reach to citizen Lambda, so that they are committed and involved. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. No, you are indeed right. I often visit the website of the Crowther Lab on Restore, and I look at the tens of thousands of small-scale restoration happening around the world, and it is these tens of thousands, when they turn into millions, I think, which is going to create both awareness but also scale, in addition to the large-scale restoration which is happening. But then I want to acknowledge also the presence of Shalini Thyani. She is the Asia Pacific Chair of the Commission for Ecosystem Management of IUCN. She has a question about incentives. So when you have legislated and there is also resources being put in place, are there incentive structures for companies, operators, communities to do restoration in the legislative framework? Thank you. Bettina?
Hi, sorry, I wasn't sure whether the question was addressed to me, but very happy to provide my perspective.
Yes.
So in the nature restoration law itself, there is no incentive structure as such included. but there are plenty of incentives embedded in, for example, the EU funding structures. So, for example, in the area of agriculture, member states, farmers can receive more funds if they do measures that are good for biodiversity and the environment. This is a very complicated topic, so I will not get into it, but just to say, in the same way that we have this in our agriculture funding, we also have it in other funding. So yes, there are incentives included in the EU funding structure.
Thank you. We are coming towards the end of this session, and I want to, before I conclude, I want to thank all the audience who have joined, and we have posted a link for you to give feedback to our webinar. This is our very first webinar, and we'll be continuing with at least one a quarter or more if possible. We plan to work very closely with the Decade for Ecosystem Restoration so that we can bring more and more events and almost form a Friends of Restoration group and make the reach further and wider. So before I conclude, I wanted to ask if any of the speakers have any final thoughts you wanted to give. You can raise your hands. Otherwise, I will probably conclude with a few more questions to the panelists. If anyone want to give any final words, that's fine. Otherwise, we have time for a couple more questions, and we have plenty of questions in the chat, and a number of them are actually directed to Bettina, but I didn't want to monopolize it that way. So what we will do is to pick up those questions, and we'll take some of them bilaterally, and we'll send out to all the participants, whose email address we have. So no questions will be left unanswered, but we didn't want to make it just a Q&A session only on the restoration law. Thank you. Okay. So if there are no specific thing, one of the questions being asked is about the system for monitoring, and I may start that with Bettina as to whether the monitoring will be at the level of the European Union, or it will be at the national level, the implementation of the legislation and its impact, or is there a system, and whether this particular proposed information center will also have a role in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the law specifically has provisions on monitoring and reporting, and per target, member states will be monitoring their progress. Here again, this will build upon what is already monitored under other legislation, be it nature legislation or water legislation, for example. And then the things that are additional in this law will, of course, also have to be monitored, and this will be reported to the Environment Agency and to us, and we will then process this and provide overviews for everybody to see how we are doing towards our targets. Of course, if there is a global center for support on the area of gathering data and monitoring to be set up, then the EU is happy to work in this context with its partners to make also, of course, our own monitoring data available, and to see how others can maybe set up separate structures that are inspired. But this being said, monitoring is of course also a quite intense activity, so we would not be imposing a very deep system of burden. On the contrary, the monitoring is supposed to help because it helps promote the progress and helps to visualize it. Whether or not at the EU level this is done or by the member states, it's a combination of both, because some things can, for example, be monitored by satellite technology. This was also already mentioned, and I heard that also, for example, indigenous populations may be inclined to use drone technology to have such access to data. in the EU, we have satellite systems that monitor also environmental concerns, and these, of course, will be used as much as possible to monitor what is necessary to be done under the restoration law.
Thank you, Bettina. We have a question, and we discussed the indigenous knowledge, and one of the questions from the floor is that as people with indigenous knowledge are a generation is dying out, are there global systems in place to capture indigenous knowledge? And maybe I'll direct that to Nick and see if you are aware, and others, if you are aware of any system, you may also raise your hands. Nick.
So Murali, I'm afraid I'm not aware of any global system, although I think such a system would be extremely useful. I know there are a number of initiatives that I'm aware of in Central and South America, which are documenting indigenous knowledge of ecosystem management. But I don't know of a global system, and I think that might actually be something that would be really valuable. And particularly that would allow a sort of meta level of analysis of many of these strategies to see what we could extract from that might be of use to in other types of ecosystem. But perhaps there are participants this afternoon who know of such systems already.
Thank you, Nick. If any other speaker want to comment on it, that's fine. Otherwise, indeed, if there is not such a system, the G20 initiative would actually discuss this with the decade and see how we can formulate such a system, because I am aware that national system does exist, and UNEP actually already in 2003 did a global survey of indigenous knowledge only for disaster management, early warning. So there could be room for others as well. We have come to the agreed time, which is an hour and a half, which I think is the optimal time for a webinar. We had excellent audience, a lot of questions, and I want to thank all the panelists and the audience for an excellent webinar. There are a number of people on the background who has been supporting this in setting it up, from our IT team to our interns, to our technical team, and I want to thank them all. And we have sent out our questionnaire, so please give your feedback. We can improve, and we'll come back to you in the new year with more topics. In the meanwhile, greetings for the holiday season and a happy new year to all. Thank you.